The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and fresh ink, the kind of scent that hinted at binding contracts and irreversible decisions. I sat at the long mahogany table, my fingers tapping an uneven rhythm against the arm of my chair. The weight of anticipation pressed against my chest, but I kept my face neutral. Rosewood Manor. The house that had been my grandmother's pride, her sanctuary, and, most importantly, my inheritance, was about to be legally transferred into my name. Or so I thought. Across the table, Vanessa, my wife of 6 years, smoothed the crease in her silk blouse, her face a picture of composed indifference. I'd once found that calm exterior comforting, reassuring even. Now, it felt like a mask, and I had no idea what lay beneath it. Next to her sat Derek, her old friend from college, the one she always insisted was just like a brother. The fact that he was sitting here at a family legal proceeding already had my gut twisting with unease. The lawyer, Harper Castillo, flipped through the final pages of my grandmother's will, her glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose. She adjusted them and cleared her throat. As per the last testament of Margaret Whitmore, the sole heir to Rosewood Manor is her grandson, Logan Whitmore. The property, valued at approximately $3.2 million, is to be transferred to Logan with immediate effect. I exhaled. This was it. But before I could fully process the relief, Vanessa leaned forward, placing a manicured hand on mine. "Logan," she said softly, as if speaking to a child who didn't understand the concept of loss, "about the house." Something in her tone made my skin prickle. I pulled my hand away. "What about it?" Derek gave a small chuckle, leaning back in his chair like he had all the time in the world. "Man, you might want to brace yourself for this one." Harper frowned, flipping through a separate folder. "Mr. Whitmore, there's an issue?" Vanessa exhaled a dramatic sigh, her perfectly lined eyes full of artificial sympathy. "We had to sell it." The words hit me like a freight train, an impact so sudden and violent that, for a moment, I didn't register their meaning. My lips parted, but nothing came out. The air in the room thickened, the world tilting off its axis. "You what?" My voice barely rose above a whisper, but the tremor in it was undeniable. Vanessa tilted her head, her expression one of practiced regret. "It was too much, Logan. The repairs alone would have drained us. You know how difficult it's been with finances. We had to make a tough call." We. The word coiled around my throat like a noose. There had been no we in this decision. I had never agreed to sell my grandmother's house. Derek crossed his arms, shaking his head like I was the one being unreasonable. "Come on, man. You couldn't even afford the property taxes. Selling was the best move." "Best move for who?" I turned back to Harper, who was still flipping through her documents, her expression darkening with every page. "The house was sold?" My voice came out steadier this time, but inside, I was unraveling. Vanessa nodded, her lips pressing together in an almost apologetic smile. "The buyer was very generous, well above market value. It was a smart decision. Smart for her. Convenient for Derek. Devastating for me." My fists clenched under the table. "Without telling me? Without my consent?" Vanessa's smile faltered, just slightly. "Logan, you have to understand." "No." I cut her off, voice sharp now. "I don't have to understand. What I have to do is figure out how the hell you managed to sell property that wasn't yours to sell." Derek scoffed, shaking his head. "Dude, it was a liability. Let it go." Let it go? Rosewood Manor was more than just a house. It was my grandmother's legacy. It was the place I spent summers as a kid, drinking lemonade on the wraparound porch, listening to her stories about how she and my grandfather had built a life there from nothing. It was the place she had promised me, over and over, since I was 12, and they had sold it behind my back? Harper finally spoke, her voice measured but edged with something that made my stomach drop. "Actually, Logan, there's something interesting here." She pulled out a document and slid it across the table. My eyes scanned the page, heart hammering as I reached the section she pointed to. Power of attorney. I felt the blood drain from my face. What the hell is this? Vanessa folded her hands neatly on the table. "Your parents granted me power of attorney over the estate." "My parents?" They had no claim over Rosewood Manor. It had always been Gran's decision to leave it to me, but I should have known. My mother, always scheming, always siding with Vanessa, had likely seen this as an opportunity to help me by putting decisions in Vanessa's hands. A sickening realization set in. The sale had already gone through. The papers were signed. I no longer owned my own inheritance. "You can't do this," I whispered, shaking my head. "Gran left it to me. It's in the will." Vanessa let out a small laugh, the condescension in it making my jaw clench. "Actually," she said, "with power of attorney, I could make the best choice for us." For us? The betrayal was a blade to my gut. Derek checked his watch. "Look, man, it's done. You're acting like we stole something. This was for your own good." I let out a bitter, hollow laugh. My own good? Selling the only thing I had left of Gran without even telling me? Harper sighed and gathered the documents back into her folder. Legally, the sale has already gone through. The finality of it hit like a second punch to the ribs. Vanessa stood, smoothing out the non-existent wrinkles in her designer blouse. "We're meeting the buyer tomorrow to hand over the keys. You should come. Make peace with it. Make peace with it." I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the edge of the table to keep from flipping it over. My entire life had just been stolen out from under me, and they were asking me to make peace with it? As the door shut behind them, I sat in stunned silence, the weight of the moment pressing down like a vice. Then I remembered the envelope in my hand. I ran my thumb over the flap, feeling the embossed initials of my grandmother's name. She knew. I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small key. "My dearest Logan, if you're reading this, they've done exactly what I feared they would. But don't worry. I've left you something they don't know about. Something that will help you fight back. Check behind the loose brick in the garden wall, the one with the heart carved into it." My pulse thundered in my ears. Gran had planned for this. They thought they had one. They thought wrong. The room was silent except for the rustling of the letter in my hands. My grandmother's handwriting was neat, deliberate, and filled with a wisdom that, even in death, felt like a guiding force. "If you're reading this, they've done exactly what I feared they would. But don't worry. I've left you something they don't know about. Something that will help you fight back. Check behind the loose brick in the garden wall, the one with the heart carved into it." I read it again and again. She knew. Not just about Vanessa, not just about Derek, but about the way people like them operated. Self-serving, manipulative, willing to twist the law just enough to make theft look like a business transaction. I exhaled sharply, gripping the letter. My grandmother was always one step ahead. Even in her final days, she had been protecting me. I had no idea what I would find behind that brick, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was, it would change everything. It was past midnight when I pulled up to Rosewood Manor. The house, no, my house, stood in eerie silence under the moonlight, its grand facade shadowed by betrayal. The "For Sale" sign stood mocking me near the curb, its reflective letters gleaming under my headlights. I should have been walking through that front door with keys in hand, ready to honor my grandmother's legacy. Instead, I was here in secret, my inheritance stolen out from under me. But not for long. I killed the engine and sat there, staring at the house. If Vanessa or Derek knew I was here, they'd spin some story about how I was acting out or being unreasonable. But I wasn't here for them. I was here for Gran. After a deep breath, I slipped out of the car and moved quietly toward the garden wall. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and roses, remnants of the garden my grandmother had tended to with so much love. Even after all these years, it still smelled like her, lavender and fresh soil. I ran my hand along the stone wall, fingers brushing over the cool, uneven bricks. It took me a moment to find it, but then, there. A small heart-shaped carving near the center of the wall. My pulse quickened. I pressed my fingers against the brick, pushing slightly. It didn't budge. I tried again, this time wiggling it gently. Still nothing. Then I remembered. The key. Pulling it from my pocket, I examined it under the moonlight. It was small, almost delicate, with an ornate design that looked like it belonged to a jewelry box rather than a garden wall. I pressed the key into the tiny crevice beside the brick and twisted. Click. The brick loosened instantly. My heart pounded as I pried it free, setting it carefully on the ground. Behind it, nestled in a shallow cavity, was a small metal box, its surface worn with time. I grabbed it with shaky hands, brushing away the dirt clinging to its edges. My breath was coming in short, uneven bursts. Whatever was inside this box was important enough for my grandmother to hide it from everyone. I popped the latch and lifted the lid. Inside were several aged documents, an envelope with my name on it, and a USB drive. I sat back on my heels, staring at them. This wasn't just some sentimental stash of memories. This was evidence. Swallowing hard, I opened the envelope first. Logan, I wish I could have told you all of this in person, but I didn't want to put you in danger. By now, you know that they've taken what isn't theirs. But what they don't know is that I saw this coming a long time ago. I knew the moment I got sick that they would circle like vultures, waiting to pick apart my life. That's why I made sure you would have everything you need to fight back. What you're holding isn't just proof of ownership, it's proof of something much bigger. Rosewood Manor is worth more than they know, and they'll do anything to keep you from finding out why. I trust you to do the right thing, my love, but be careful. The people involved won't go down without a fight. Gran. My fingers tightened around the paper. Proof of something bigger. My mind raced. What the hell had Gran been hiding? I grabbed the stack of documents and began scanning them under the dim glow of my phone's flashlight. And that's when I saw it. A legal clause, dated 6 months before her passing. It was buried deep in the paperwork, but clear as day. The property known as Rosewood Manor cannot be sold, transferred, or altered in any way without the explicit written consent of Logan Whitmore, the sole heir. My breath hitched. They hadn't just stolen from me. They had forged my consent. I closed my eyes, exhaling through my nose. I felt a mixture of rage, relief, and something else entirely, power. Because now, I had leverage. I secured the documents back inside the metal box and tucked the USB drive into my pocket. Whatever was on it, I'd review later. Right now, I needed to get out of here before someone, Vanessa, Derek, or the mysterious buyer they had lined up, realized what I had just uncovered. I stood, brushing the dirt from my jeans, and carefully slid the brick back into place. No one could know I had been here. As I made my way back to my car, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from Vanessa. "Where are you? We need to talk." I scoffed. Now she wanted to talk? I ignored the message and climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had spent the past week drowning in betrayal, watching the life I was supposed to inherit slip through my fingers. But my grandmother had known better. She had given me the lifeline I needed. Vanessa and Derek thought they had one. They thought I was helpless. But they had made one critical mistake. They forgot to read the fine print. And now, it was my turn to take everything back. The next morning, I walked into Harper Castillo's office, the metal box clutched tightly under my arm. I hadn't slept. My mind had been racing ever since I pried that brick loose in Rosewood Manor's garden wall. The documents, the letter from Gran, and that USB drive. They were all proof that my inheritance had been stolen from me. But I needed someone who could translate legal jargon into something actionable. And Harper? She was the best in the business. Her office smelled like fresh coffee and leather-bound books, the kind of place where people got their lives back after they'd been screwed over. She sat behind her desk, her short auburn hair tucked behind her ears, dark eyes sharp as ever as she gestured for me to sit. "You look like hell," she said, eyeing the deep circles under my eyes. I set the metal box on her desk. "I've had a long night." She arched an eyebrow but said nothing as she flipped open the box and pulled out the documents. I leaned forward, watching as her gaze flicked across the pages. And then she froze. Her fingers tightened around the paper, her lips pressing into a thin line. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly before looking up at me. "Logan," she said, "do you realize what you're holding?" I swallowed hard. Gran's letter said this was proof of something bigger, that the house, my house, couldn't be sold without my permission. Harper nodded, tapping the page with her finger. "Your grandmother was smart. Smarter than they gave her credit for. She added a very specific non-transferability clause to her will 6 months before she passed. That means no matter what power of attorney your parents granted Vanessa, this house was never legally hers to sell. My pulse kicked up. I sat up straighter. So the sale is void? A slow, knowing smile spread across Harper's face. Not just void. Fraudulent. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. They forged my signature, didn't they? She nodded. Absolutely. And that's a felony. I felt a sharp pang of anger in my chest, but I forced myself to focus. So, what happens now? Can I get the house back? Harper's eyes gleamed with something dangerously close to satisfaction. Not only can you get the house back, but anyone involved in this fraud is in serious legal trouble. Forging a legal heir's consent? That's not a slap on the wrist. That's jail time. Jail time. I let that sink in for a moment. Vanessa, Derek, my so-called wife and her lover. They thought they had outsmarted me, that they could rip my inheritance away, pocket the money, and move on like I was just some naive fool. But they forgot one thing. Gran saw this coming. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the USB drive I had found in the box. I don't know what's on this, but my grandmother left it for me. She said it would help me fight back. Harper took the drive, turning it over in her fingers. We'll find out soon enough. She plugged it into her computer, and the screen flickered to life. A folder popped up. Financial records. Legal documents. Emails. Harper clicked the first file. A scanned email exchange appeared between Vanessa and a real estate broker. I leaned in. Vanessa, we need this sale to go through ASAP. My husband doesn't need to know the details. Just make sure the paperwork is handled. Broker, without his signature, this won't be legal. Vanessa, we'll take care of that. Harper sat back, her hands laced together. There it is. I clenched my fists. She knew she was breaking the law. She clicked on another file. This time, it was a transaction record. Derek's name. A wire transfer to an offshore account. Harper whistled. Well. Looks like Derek wasn't just in it for the fun of it. He was getting paid. Of course he was. They weren't just partners in betrayal. They were criminals. My phone buzzed on the desk. I glanced at it. A text from Vanessa. Vanessa, we need to talk. This is getting out of hand. I let out a bitter laugh. She's panicking. Harper smirked. Good. She should be. I locked my phone, looking back at Harper. What's our next move? She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. First, we stop the sale before they hand over the keys to the buyer. I'm going to file a legal injunction. That'll freeze everything. And after that? She picked up the fraudulent document and waved it slightly. Then we expose them. A slow smile curled at the edges of my lips. Good. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't the one being played. Vanessa and Derek had thought they could rob me blind. They had thought I would roll over, too stunned to fight back. They were dead wrong. Harper closed the folder on her computer. The buyer, Edward Jackson, is coming in today. He should know his purchase isn't valid. I nodded. Let's tell him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The game had just begun. The walls of Harper Castillo's office felt smaller than they had the last time I sat here. Maybe it was because, this time, I wasn't the one drowning. Vanessa and Derek were about to learn what it felt like to be backed into a corner. Harper had filed the injunction hours ago, freezing the sale of Rosewood Manor before the transfer could be finalized. Vanessa and Derek thought they had sealed the deal, but now the buyer himself, Edward Jackson, was about to learn the truth. I was more than ready to watch his reaction. A sharp knock echoed through the office. Harper straightened her posture. That's him. I nodded, adjusting my grip on the forged sale document sitting on Harper's desk. The evidence was all here. The emails, the signatures, the fraud. Edward Jackson had paid well over market value for my house. Money that Vanessa and Derek had likely planned to disappear with. Now, he was about to find out that he had no legal claim to it. Harper called out, "Come in." The door opened, and in walked Edward Jackson. Late 40s, well-dressed, and carrying the kind of casual confidence that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. Wealthy, well-connected, a man who didn't make bad business deals. Until now, Mr. Whitmore. He gave me a polite nod before shaking Harper's hand. Miss Castillo, always a pleasure. Harper motioned to the chair across from me. Please have a seat. Edward sat, smoothing his blazer before resting his hands on the desk. I assume this is about Rosewood Manor? Harper didn't waste time. Yes. And I'm afraid there's been a major legal issue regarding the sale. Edward's expression barely shifted, but I saw the slight tensing of his jaw. He glanced at me, then back at Harper. Go on. Harper slid the forged sale agreement across the desk. This is the contract you signed, correct? He picked it up, scanning the page. Yes. It has all necessary signatures. I leaned forward, my voice steady. Including mine? Edward's gaze lifted. I assume so. You were listed as the legal heir, weren't you? Harper gave him a tight smile. He was. Which makes this signature. She tapped a finger against the page. Very interesting. Edward frowned. Why? I pulled out my flight receipt from the day of the supposed signing and placed it in front of him. Because I wasn't even in the state when this was signed. His eyes flicked over the receipt. Then, his fingers tightened slightly on the document in his hand. This is a joke, right? He said slowly. No joke, Harper replied. That's a forged signature, Mr. Jackson, meaning the sale is fraudulent. Edward set the contract down carefully, exhaling through his nose. For the first time, I saw uncertainty cross his features. They told me you had agreed to the sale, he said, directing his words at me. They said you didn't have time to be present for the signing, but that you gave consent. I scoffed. They lied. His brows furrowed. They assured me everything was in order. Harper flipped through another file and pulled out a stack of printed emails. I assume you'd recognize these? She slid them across the table. Edward hesitated, then started reading. I watched his eyes move over the text. His lips parted slightly. Then, his entire demeanor changed. What the hell is this? He muttered, eyes narrowing as he flipped through the pages. His confusion turned into something else, anger. I already knew which email he had landed on. Vanessa, we need this sale to go through ASAP. My husband doesn't need to know the details, just make sure the paperwork is handled. Broker, without his signature, this won't be legal. Vanessa, we'll take care of that. Edward clenched his jaw, setting the papers down. When he finally spoke, his voice was sharper. They told me this was a clean transaction. I let out a dry laugh. Yeah, well, Vanessa is a lot of things. Honest isn't one of them. Edward leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers against the desk. He looked irritated. Then, something strange happened. He sighed and said, I should have known better. I blinked. Excuse me? Edward ran a hand through his neatly combed hair. Your mother. I stiffened. My mother? He hesitated, then exhaled. Vanessa and Derek weren't the only ones pushing for the sale. Harper's head tilted slightly. What do you mean? Edward picked up one of the emails, his mouth pressing into a thin line. Your mother, Catherine Whitmore, was involved. My blood ran cold. I hadn't even considered my mother's role in this. She was always a little distant, more interested in high society fundraisers than family affairs, but I never imagined she would help Vanessa steal from me. Edward set the papers down, looking at me carefully. She assured me this was the right decision. She said you were too emotionally attached to let go of the house, but that you weren't financially stable enough to maintain it. Harper gave a sharp laugh. That's convenient, because that's not her call to make. Edward rubbed his temple. No, it's not. And now I'm realizing how deep this mess goes. He met my gaze. They planned this for months, didn't they? I nodded. Since before Gran even passed. He let out a slow breath. I need to reconsider my options. Harper folded her hands on the desk. Are you willing to make a formal statement regarding these emails? If you do, it will help strengthen Logan's case against them. Edward hesitated for a moment. Then, he nodded. Yes. I should have asked more questions when they insisted on rushing everything through. Something felt off. I sat back, absorbing the moment. For the first time, someone besides me saw through Vanessa's lies. And this was just the beginning. Edward stood, adjusting his blazer. I'll have my legal team draft something today. He looked at me. For what it's worth, I had no idea this was happening. And I have no intention of keeping a house that wasn't legally sold to me. Harper nodded. That's the right choice. Edward glanced at the emails one last time, then turned toward the door. He paused. I'll be in touch soon. Then, he left. Harper turned to me with a smirk. Well, that was easier than expected. I exhaled, rolling my shoulders. It's not over yet. No, she agreed, but they're starting to lose their grip. I picked up Vanessa's email and read it one more time. She had pushed for this sale, desperate to get rid of the house as fast as possible. Why? What was she so afraid I'd find? Whatever the answer was, I had a feeling I'd find out soon. And when I did, there would be no coming back from it. I didn't call Vanessa. I didn't text her back. I let her stew. After my meeting with Edward Jackson, I could only imagine what kind of panic was brewing on her end. By now, she knew the sale was frozen. She knew that Harper had evidence of fraud. And she knew that I wasn't going to roll over and let them steal Rosewood Manor from me. I wanted her to feel it, the pressure, the uncertainty, the fear. And I didn't have to wait long. By the time I pulled into my driveway that evening, Vanessa was already there, waiting. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed, tapping her nails against her sleeve. Her face was a perfect mix of forced calm and concealed rage. I barely put my car in park before she stormed down the steps. "Logan," she snapped, her heels clicking against the pavement. "What the hell are you doing?" I stepped out, locking my car with deliberate slowness. "Oh, I don't know, Vanessa. Maybe stopping my wife from committing fraud." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You're blowing this out of proportion." I let out a dry laugh. "I am? You forged my signature. You sold my grandmother's house behind my back. And now, the sale's frozen. Your buyer knows you lied, and you have nowhere to run." Her jaw tightened. "Logan, listen to me." "No," I took a step closer. "For once, you listen." She faltered. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" I asked, my voice low and controlled. "Did you think I'd just accept that the house was sold and move on?" She scoffed. "I thought you'd be reasonable." I gritted my teeth. "Reasonable?" "Yes, Logan," she hissed. "Because that house is a burden. It's old, it's expensive, and it's not like you have the means to. You don't get to decide that." Her mouth snapped shut. I leaned in slightly. "Tell me something, Vanessa. Was this just about the money? Or was there something else?" She blinked. "What are you talking about?" I watched her carefully. "Edward told me you were desperate to sell as fast as possible. Even after the will was read, you were pushing for it to happen immediately. Almost like you didn't want me to step foot in that house before it was gone." Her throat bobbed in a nervous swallow. "Bingo." I stepped back, nodding. "So that's it then." She straightened her posture, folding her arms. "That's what?" I smirked. "You weren't just after the money. You were hiding something." She let out a forced laugh. "Oh, come on, Logan. You sound paranoid." I tilted my head, watching her. She was slipping. "Tell me," I continued, "was it just you and Derek? Or was my mother part of this too?" The color drained from her face. "Gotcha. Yeah," I said, nodding slowly. "Edward told me. My mother was involved." She swallowed hard. "Logan, don't do this." I laughed. "Do what? Expose you?" She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You don't know the whole story." I held up a finger. "And whose fault is that?" She hesitated. I continued. "You lied to me. Stole from me. Now, the sale is frozen, and you and Derek are on the hook for fraud. So tell me, Vanessa, what exactly am I supposed to do?" She opened her mouth, but before she could answer, a car pulled up behind mine. "Derek." I turned as he got out, slamming the door behind him. His walk was slower than usual, more cautious. Like he could already tell he was walking into a disaster. "Vanessa," he said tightly, "we need to talk. Now." She whirled on him. "Not here." I chuckled. "Oh, please, don't stop on my account." Derek exhaled through his nose, then turned to me. "You're really pulling this, huh?" I crossed my arms. "Pulling what? Stopping you from committing a felony?" He scoffed. You can't win this, man. I raised an eyebrow. Oh? Because last I checked, Harper already froze the sale. Edward is willing to testify, and, oh, right? You committed fraud? Vanessa ran a hand through her hair, exhaling sharply. This is getting out of hand. I smirked. You're right. But not for me. Derek clenched his jaw. You don't understand. I cut him off. No, you don't understand. You thought you could walk all over me, take what wasn't yours, and walk away with a profit. But you made one mistake. Derek gave a mocking smile. Oh yeah? What's that? I held up my phone and played the audio clip. Vanessa's voice crackled through the speaker. We need this sale to go through ASAP. My husband doesn't need to know the details. Just make sure the paperwork is handled. Derek paled. Vanessa's breath hitched. I tilted my head. I wonder what the authorities would think of this. Derek took a step forward, voice low. You wouldn't. I grinned. Try me. Vanessa grabbed his arm. Derek, shut up. But it was too late. Derek had panicked. And in that panic, he had confirmed everything. I pocketed my phone. This is what's going to happen. You're going to stay the hell away from me. You're going to start preparing for what happens when this case goes to court. And then, you're going to watch as everything you stole gets taken right back. Vanessa swallowed. You don't have to do this. I stared at her. Really? After everything? I leaned in slightly. I didn't do this, Vanessa. You did. She didn't have a response. Derek exhaled, shaking his head. You have no idea what you're starting. I smirked. And you have no idea how much I'm going to enjoy watching you lose. For the first time, Vanessa and Derek looked afraid. They thought they had everything under control. Thought I was too stupid, too trusting, too weak to fight back. They were wrong. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. And I wasn't done yet. By the time I left Vanessa and Derek standing in my driveway, their faces pale with shock, I knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. They thought they could talk their way out of this, manipulate the situation, spin it in their favor. But the moment I played that audio clip, the fear in their eyes told me everything. They knew they had lost control, and I intended to keep it that way. The next morning, I was back in Harper Castillo's office, watching as she filed the necessary paperwork to escalate things legally. She sat behind her desk, fingers flying over the keyboard, her expression sharp and focused. They're going to come at you hard, she said without looking up. Vanessa, Derek, even your mother. Once they realize they're backed into a corner, they'll fight dirty. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling through my nose. Let them. I have facts. They have fraud and wishful thinking. Harper smirked, finally looking at me. I like your confidence. I smirked back. I like my odds. She hit a final key and sat back, crossing her arms. All right. The injunction against the sale is fully processed. That means Rosewood Manor is legally untouchable until this investigation is settled. I nodded. That was step one. Step two? Holding them accountable. I slid the USB drive across the desk. This has all the emails, transactions, and proof of what they've been planning for months. Harper picked it up and inserted it into her laptop. The files popped up instantly, and I watched as her eyes scanned the information. Her smirk faded. She clicked on an offshore account record. Well, she murmured. Looks like Derek wasn't just helping Vanessa. He was getting paid for it. I raised an eyebrow. How much? Harper leaned closer to the screen. 50 grand wired to a personal account, labeled as a consulting fee. I let out a sharp laugh. Consulting? What? Was he consulting on how to commit felony fraud? Harper shook her head, scrolling through more transactions. And here's another payout, 75 grand, funneled through one of your mother's accounts. I stiffened. My mother paid him? She nodded. Looks like she was knee-deep in this from the start. Vanessa and Derek were the front-facing criminals, but Catherine Whitmore? She was financing the whole damn thing. I clenched my jaw, staring at the screen. I had already suspected my mother was involved. Edward had confirmed it, but seeing the actual money trail made it undeniable. She had known. She had helped them steal from me. And now? I had the proof to burn them all. Harper glanced at me. You ready to take this to the authorities? I exhaled, nodding. Let's do it. An hour later, we were sitting in Detective Jonathan Morris's office at the local police department. He was an older guy, built like a retired linebacker, with a no-nonsense demeanor that told me he had seen every trick in the book. He leaned forward, scanning the evidence we had just handed over. His expression remained neutral, but I could see his jaw tighten slightly as he flipped through the documents. "This is substantial," he muttered, picking up one of the printed emails. "Forgery, financial fraud, and wire transfers to an offshore account. That's not just some family dispute. That's a full-blown criminal case." Harper nodded. "Exactly. And the individuals involved, Vanessa Whitmore, Derek Tate, and Catherine Whitmore, have all actively participated in this fraud." Morris exhaled, rubbing his chin. "We're going to need to verify all of this. But if it checks out," he set the documents down, "there will be arrests." The weight of that statement sank in. I had walked into this office hoping for justice, but now it was real. Vanessa and Derek wouldn't just lose the money. They wouldn't just lose the house. They would lose their freedom. And my mother? She had made her choice the moment she conspired with them. I nodded. "Do what you have to do." Morris glanced between me and Harper, then leaned forward. "One more thing. Have they caught wind that you're pressing charges?" I smirked. "Oh, they'll know soon enough." Morris chuckled, shaking his head. "Let me give you some advice, Mr. Whitmore. People like this, they get desperate. The moment they realize they're out of options, they start making mistakes." I met his gaze. "Good. Let them." He picked up the phone and made the call. And just like that, the criminal investigation was officially underway. That evening, my phone started buzzing like crazy. I didn't even need to look at the screen to know who it was. I smirked, leaning back on my couch, watching as Vanessa's name flashed across my screen. Call after call. She was panicking. Good. I let it ring, my smirk widening. Then, a text popped up. "Vanessa. Logan. Pick up. This is serious." Then another. "Vanessa. You don't understand what you're doing." And then a final one that made me laugh out loud. "Vanessa. You're betraying the family." Oh, that was rich. I was betraying the family? I grabbed my phone, typing a single response before shutting it off. "Me? Betraying the family? You mean like how you betrayed me? You should be more worried about what the police are going to think." I hit send. Vanessa had played her last card. And now? It was my turn. The moment I sent that text to Vanessa, I knew I had just set off a bomb. I imagined her sitting in her overpriced condo, clutching her phone with shaking hands, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the screen as she scrambled for a response. I imagined Derek pacing behind her, realizing that for the first time, they were the ones being played. And the best part? They had no idea what was coming next. Because now, it wasn't just about the fraud. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what they had been hiding in Rosewood Manor. The next morning, I drove straight to the house. It was technically still mine, legally frozen, untouchable to Vanessa, Derek, or even my mother. But the sale had been so close to completion that they had already started moving things out. I could see it from the driveway. Boxes stacked near the entrance, furniture wrapped in plastic, the scent of stale air drifting through the open door. They had been preparing to strip this place bare. Too bad for them. I was here to take back what was mine. I stepped inside, the wooden floors creaking beneath my feet. Dust particles danced in the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of the sunroom. My grandmother's favorite place in the house. That was where I started. Gran had been deliberate in everything she did. She wouldn't have just left a key and a letter if there wasn't something truly important hidden here. I walked along the walls, running my fingers over the old wood paneling. The room smelled like dried lavender. Like her, my chest tightened. I had spent so many afternoons here, listening to her stories, drinking tea, watching the world pass by outside. It felt wrong that I had almost lost it to people who never deserved it in the first place. Then my fingers brushed against something. A seam in the wood. I froze. Carefully, I pressed against it. A panel shifted under my touch. My heart pounded as I grabbed the edge and pulled. The wooden panel slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, was a metal box, larger than the one I had found in the garden. My hands shook as I pulled it out. It was heavy. Too heavy to just be more documents. I set it on the floor, wiped my palms against my jeans, and flipped the latch. The lid creaked open. Inside, nestled carefully among layers of aged velvet, were paintings. I sucked in a sharp breath. Not just any paintings. Expensive ones. Even under the dim light, I could tell, they were originals. Oil paintings, their colors still rich despite their age, their brushstrokes detailed and deliberate. And then it clicked. This wasn't just a collection. This was stolen art. I sat back on my heels, running a hand through my hair. My grandmother, my sweet, intelligent, always a step ahead grandmother, had been hiding a fortune in smuggled artwork. That's why Vanessa had been so desperate to get rid of the house. That's why she had rushed the sale. That's why she had forged my signature. She hadn't just been after the money from the sale. She was trying to secure whatever was hidden inside this house before I could find it. And my mother had known, too. I took a steadying breath, my mind racing. There were at least a dozen paintings in this box. If they were originals, if they were valuable, then that meant I needed someone who could verify this. I pulled out my phone and dialed Harper. She picked up on the second ring. Logan? You need to get to Rosewood Manor, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my head. Why? I glanced back at the box. Because I just found something that's going to blow this case wide open. 30 minutes later, Harper was kneeling beside the box, carefully lifting one of the paintings. She turned it toward the light, her lips parting slightly as she examined the brushstrokes. She let out a low whistle. Logan, she murmured, do you have any idea what this is? I swallowed hard. I have a feeling you're about to tell me. She glanced at me, eyes sharp with something I rarely saw in her. Genuine astonishment. This is a lost impressionist piece. She turned it slightly, studying the signature at the bottom. And if this is real, then it's worth at least 7 figures. I stared at her. 7 figures? She nodded, setting the painting back in the box with careful hands. Maybe more, depending on the provenance. I exhaled. My mind was spinning. I had walked into this house expecting to take back my inheritance. I had expected legal battles, financial recovery, justice. I hadn't expected to find a fortune in stolen art. Harper dusted off her hands and stood. We need to get these authenticated. I ran a hand down my face. And then what? She met my gaze, her expression serious. Then we find out exactly who was trying to smuggle them out of here. I clenched my jaw. We already know who. Harper folded her arms. Then it's time to make sure they don't get away with it. By the time I locked up the house and drove home, I was no longer just fighting for my inheritance. I was fighting to expose a much bigger crime. This wasn't just fraud. This was art theft. Smuggling. A crime that went beyond Vanessa and Derek. And my mother? She had been involved in this from the very beginning. I pulled into my driveway, gripping the steering wheel tightly. They thought they had buried their secrets. They thought I would never find them. But Gran had left me the key. And now? Now, I was going to use it. By the time Harper Castillo had arranged for the artwork to be authenticated, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a case of fraud anymore. This was about stolen art, laundered money, and a cover-up that had been brewing for decades. And my own mother was at the center of it. The revelation still made my stomach twist. I had spent the past few weeks thinking Vanessa and Derek were the masterminds. That they had schemed behind my back, forged my signature, and tried to steal Rosewood Manor for their own greed. And while that was still true, they weren't acting alone. They were covering up something much bigger. And now? Now, I had proof. The next morning, I met Detective Jonathan Morris at a high-security storage facility, where Harper had sent the paintings for further examination. Morris was a man who rarely showed emotion, but as we stood in front of a half-dozen stolen masterpieces, I saw something close to disbelief flicker across his face. This, he said, adjusting his glasses, is not what I expected when you walked into my office last week. I exhaled. Trust me. Neither did I. A man in a suit stepped forward. Dr. Leonard Hale, one of the country's top forensic art experts, pulled off his gloves and nodded at Morris. It's confirmed. These are original works. At least 3 of them have been missing for over a decade. 2 were reported stolen from private collectors in Europe, And this one, he pointed to a particularly stunning piece. This painting alone is valued at over $10 million. I stiffened. 10 million? Morris let out a low whistle. Jesus. Dr. Hale folded his arms. The real question is, how did these end up in your grandmother's house? I swallowed hard. That was the question, wasn't it? Gran had always been a collector of beautiful things, but she wasn't a thief, which meant she had either been hiding these paintings knowingly, or she had discovered them later and didn't know what to do. Either way, the only people who seemed desperate to keep them buried were Vanessa, Derek, and my mother. Morris turned to me, his expression unreadable. Where's your mother now? I clenched my jaw. Still in town. I have a feeling she's about to skip, though. He nodded. We'll make sure that doesn't happen. Later that night, I drove to my mother's estate. I wasn't surprised to see her already packing. Boxes stacked near the entrance. Suitcases lined up by the door. She had always been a woman who ran when things got messy. When my father left, she had disappeared for nearly a year. When Gran got sick, she barely visited, saying she couldn't handle the grief. And now? Now she was trying to vanish before her crimes caught up with her. Too bad for her. I wasn't letting that happen. I stepped inside without knocking. She turned sharply, eyes widening for half a second before slipping back into her usual mask of poise and indifference. Logan, she said, her voice smooth as silk. This is a surprise. I let out a cold laugh. Is it? She tilted her head. What's with the tone? I gestured to the suitcases. Going somewhere? She gave me a tight smile. Business trip. Liar. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered. I stepped closer, placing my hands on the back of one of the expensive leather chairs in her sitting room. They found the paintings. A long silence stretched between us. She didn't gasp. She didn't feign shock. She just stared at me, like she was calculating. Finally, she exhaled, walking over to a side table to pour herself a glass of wine. I assume Harper has already handed everything over to the police. I narrowed my eyes. That's all you have to say? She took a sip, sighing. Logan, don't be so dramatic. My grip tightened on the chair. Dramatic? She set her glass down and finally looked me in the eye. What's done is done. I laughed. A hollow, humorless sound. You think you're just going to walk away from this? She sighed. Darling, I was trying to protect you. I felt something snap inside me. Protect me? I stepped forward. You helped Vanessa and Derek steal my inheritance. You covered up stolen artwork. You laundered money through a real estate scam. And you think you were protecting me? She exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. You don't understand. No, I snapped. You don't understand. Her lips pressed together, her hands curling into fists. I continued. I loved Gran. I respected her. And she left that house to me because she knew the kind of people you surrounded yourself with. A flicker of something in her eyes. Anger, maybe, or regret. I wasn't sure anymore. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up. You know what this is? She exhaled. Logan. It's the arrest warrant that's about to be served. For the first time, her face paled. I smirked. You thought I'd let this slide? She straightened her posture, her usual coldness slipping back into place. I'll get a lawyer. I shrugged. Yeah, you'll need one. A knock sounded at the door. She turned sharply, realizing what was happening. I smiled. Too late, Mom. The door opened, and Detective Morris stepped inside. Catherine Whitmore? He said, his voice firm. My mother inhaled deeply, composing herself. Yes? Morris held up a piece of paper. You're under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. You really did it, didn't you? I nodded. Gran always said, the truth will come out in the end. She gave me one last look before they cuffed her wrists. As the officers led her out, I took a deep breath. It was over. Vanessa and Derek were going down. My mother was finally facing justice. And me? I was finally free. 2 weeks later, I walked into Rosewood Manor, this time as its rightful owner. The stained glass windows caught the golden light of the setting sun, casting warm colors across the floor. I ran my fingers along the wooden panels of the sunroom, the same place Gran had hidden her secrets. I found one last note tucked inside the folds of an old book. Logan, you were always the one I trusted. I knew you'd do the right thing, not just for yourself, but for our family's true legacy. Some families break apart to become stronger. I hope you build something better. Love, Gran. I exhaled, folding the letter. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. Vanessa was gone. Derek was gone. My mother would finally answer for what she had done. And Rosewood Manor was mine again. Now, it was time to turn it into a home. A real one. The way Gran always wanted.